Okay, maybe, okay.
It's good? Okay, well, thanks for coming. Thanks for being willing to listen. I hope this is interesting. What I want to convey is how I've been weaving ham radio into presentations to non-ham audiences that are interested in the March 11th earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis. So as for the title tonight, high water? Well, yeah, the tsunami had run up heights to 40 meters in Ofinato City.
That's hard to believe.
It is. I mean, that would spoil even the great antenna farm you were talking about. And more importantly, I think, for more than 500 kilometers of coastline, it was 10 meters or more. Yeah. So definitely high water. Ham radio, well, okay. All of us in this room are amateurs by vocation and professionals by training. For almost 7 years, I've been trying to be a radiation guy by way of nuclear accidents. So without any formal education, but we've all been on this steep learning curve for things regarding ionizing radiation. As a consequence, since 2011, I've been around the world explaining facts about Japan's earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis. And, you know, people are willing to pick up the tab on my travel expenses. Some naysayers think this is kind of a bribe, but anyone who's traveled extensively knows that travel is exhausting.
Because sure can be, yes.
Yeah. What about hell? Okay, I will ask you to form your own opinions, and I'll give you mine toward the end. How's that? Now, Japan doesn't have a monopoly on earthquakes. The same year, so 2011, Oklahoma State, in the middle of United States, continental 48, had a magnitude 5.6 quake. Now, we have to scale that circle down to show the magnitude 7 that Haiti experienced in 2010. The magnitude scale is a log scale, and all those logs can do a lot of damage. In the case of Haiti, that magnitude 7 was right around the capital Port-au-Prince and other populated areas, and 1 million people were homeless. And the number of fatalities is highly debated. The record keeping just isn't as good as it is in Japan, but 1 million people without homes from a magnitude 7. Now, we have to scale that magnitude 7 down again to show what a magnitude 9 is. On March 9th, 2011, the magnitude 7 we experienced in Tohoku was just a foreshock. And then the real thing came at 2:46 p.m. on March 11th, so almost 7 years ago. By the way, these graphics are from Oregon Public Broadcasting because the state of Oregon is right between the seismically active Washington state and the seismically active state of California, and the Pacific coast of the United States is overdue for a big event.
They've been saying that. Yeah.
They've been saying that, and there was that in the ocean earthquake off of Alaska. Is it about a month ago now?
I think I heard something about that.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, and they were worried about a tsunami, and fortunately, not so much. So perfect timing.
This is TIARA.
This is TIARA.
Yes. Oh, we saved the seat for you. Don't worry. Thanks.
So that's the anxiety on the Pacific coast of the United States. Our event was on Japan's Pacific coast, close to the politically significant 38th parallel. I'll come back to the 38th parallel toward the end of the talk. But for now, the geological significance is that slippage along the fault line was as much as 30 meters. And parts of the coast of Japan sprang east into the ocean by as much as 5 meters. Yeah, that explains what we saw happen on the coast with the tsunami. These are typical scenes. And since we were talking about travel just a second ago, anyone ever been stuck with a layover at an airport or had trouble with airline connections?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's a universal experience for anyone who travels. So imagine being one of the lucky ones at Sendai Airport, trapped on the second floor of the concourse for 2 days. Because Sendai Airport is just a couple kilometers from the coast, so it flooded. Yeah, and those passengers were stuck on the second floor. Look, you see a little flagger there too. Not a good situation. Now, Fukushima City, inland from the coast.
How much inland?
We're about 40 kilometers inland. Yeah, and separated by one of the mountain ranges that divides Fukushima into coastal, middle, and inland. So we're not super inland, but definitely inland from the tsunami. But we end up, if you look at this kind of damage, with our share of evacuees. And, you know, this is Japan. There is a system of sheltering for people who need to evacuate their homes. This primary school is just a block from faculty housing, and there's the sign, and, you know, people were being accommodated here. Now, people are being accommodated all over Tohoku Coast as evacuees, but there are problems, okay? Shelter hazards. Many people, few toilets. So that's a potential hygiene problem. Old guys like me with bigger and bigger prostates are going to go on fluid restriction to avoid having to get up and go in the middle of the night. Yeah, and it's cold outside. Maybe there's nowhere to go closer to the nuclear plant. People are afraid of airborne radiation, so there's this tendency to just stay put in the shelter. Immobility, fluid restriction. Maybe you have your medicine, maybe you don't. That's a setup for deep venous thrombosis. You might have heard this. Say it again? Thank you for saying that. Because all these things can happen inside an airplane over the course of a 12-hour flight to North America or a 12-hour flight to Europe. So imagine days and days on end of immobilizing yourself in a shelter. So thank you for saying economy class syndrome.
Did it actually happen?
And yes, and we were dispatching teams to do ultrasound screening of people's veins to check for it.
How do you treat that?
We were also giving away compression stockings. You can also anticoagulate people, but it helps to already be properly diagnosed and in the care of a physician. But yeah, this was a real medical issue. Now, but so inland from the tsunami, evacuation has its medical problems. Let's go back to the coast. 4 nuclear facilities, they all went into automatic shutdown like they're supposed to do. But even in shutdown, you have to keep the cores cool, and to keep the cores cool, you need electricity. So, in the case of Fukushima Daiichi, the 3 electrical backups failed. The grid coming back into the plant, those towers were knocked over by the tsunami. But inside the plant, there are diesel generators and batteries, but they were below the inundation height. And you know, in front of an audience of hams, anyone who's done a de-expedition or even a field day knows, don't put the generator where it could be flooded. But I don't know all the economic considerations of building a nuclear plant. But in retrospect, well, the retrospectoscope is 20/20 vision, yeah? So all 3 sources of backup power were lost, couldn't keep the cores cooled, and so that did not result in a nuclear explosion. I'm still having to explain that to civilians sometimes. It was the buildup of hydrogen gas which breached the containment. It was too much pressure for the containment, and a lot of radioisotopes came out with those explosions. The wind with the main explosions was blowing out over the Pacific, but eventually a few days later the wind shifted inland, and that's when we got our spike in Fukushima City. 9.2 times background according to our physics department. But I get more than that when I'm flying in an airplane at cruising altitude from cosmic rays.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In fact, I've been carrying, I don't have these slides in this particular presentation, but I carry a portable Geiger counter. And on the transpolar route, I've clocked as much as 62 times what I find on the ground in either the United States or Japan at cruising altitude. But the time is short. That's fact. Yes, it's not continuous. But think of the people who make their living flying at cruising altitude. You know, flight attendants and pilots. And there's no discrimination against marrying a stewardess. But we're worried about my 2 nieces, my honorary nieces in Fukushima. You know, there might be some prejudice when it comes time for them to get married. Yeah, because there was prejudice against the bomb hibakusha 70 years ago. But we're working on that. That's a social problem more than a medical problem. Anyway, so yeah, explosions at Fukushima Daiichi. But the fact is, every facility along the coast was vulnerable, and at least 118 medical facilities, hospitals, clinics, nursing homes, elder care facilities, were wrecked. Yeah, so that's the thing to bear in mind in terms of morbidity and mortality after an accident of this magnitude. As a result of this, just focusing on Fukushima Prefecture, 8 major hospitals, including Fukushima Medical University's hospital, went into emergency response mode for anywhere from 11 to 24 days. That means turning away elective surgery, regular outpatient appointments, and just focusing on emergency care. It was a busy time with a lot of civilian and military ambulances coming and going. Fortunately, our hospital remained fully operational, but some office space was in chaos. One American guy thought it was pretty smart to have a laser printer on top of a 4-drawer filing cabinet. Well, no. But that printer, made in Japan, still works. As does my rice cooker that fell off of the table in my kitchen back at the apartment. Yeah. Okay. Miyagi Red Cross Blood Center also had office space in chaos. They were inland from the tsunami, so their water problem was a broken water pipe that caused a little bit of flooding in their facility. Also, platelets for transfusion were lost because the platelet shaker gently agitates the platelets to keep them from clumping and keeping them at just the right temperature, tipped over. And the heavy iron with delicate electronics used for infectious disease screening, a couple of the modules were pulled apart by several centimeters. You can imagine if it's delicate equipment. Yeah, that was decommissioned for more than a month. Well, you might say, okay, but it's just one blood center. Yes, but as a result of consolidation to take care of economies of scale and as testing for infectious disease gets more complex, this one center is responsible for all the blood in the 6 prefectures of Tohoku. Yeah. So if you need transfusion and suddenly more on that later. All right. Now, radiation anxiety may have influenced Red Cross thinking because 2 blood depots near the coast, including one in the 20 to 30 kilometer band around Fukushima Daiichi, had their inventories transferred. Blood products ready for transfusion were hauled back to Fukushima City. Plasma, still in quarantine, was airlifted to Kyushu, actually. Now, historically, blood banks were based right inside hospitals. Mayo Clinic established America's first blood bank in 1935, followed in 1937 at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, where the name blood bank was coined by a Hungarian immigrant, Dr. Bernard Fantas. In Japan, hospital-based autologous programs are still quite common. That's giving your own blood prior to elective surgery. And that is generally hospital-based. But everything else is in the hands of the Red Cross. Their collection trucks, their collection rooms, their processing centers. So if you want blood, you need roads and fuel, air transportation, electricity, water, and communication. This matters because not just hematology patients, not just chronic patients, trauma patients do. Altogether, transfusion is the most common medical procedure in hospitals. Yeah. And trauma should come to mind when you hear the word earthquake. So more than just the chronic and the hematology patients. Yeah. So our university prepared to step back in time and have an emergency blood bank for trauma patients that might be coming in. So here's paperwork from March 14th, where my colleague, Dr. Kano, is the physician, and I'm the prospective donor agreeing to infectious disease testing as a possible emergency donor. Our infectious disease testing protocols are a little bit different from the Red Cross but we maintain the same ability to irradiate blood. Has anyone ever heard of irradiating blood before transfusion?
What does that do? What is it?
Okay, it's because one of the side effects, potential side effects of transfusion, is called transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. The white cells, the immune cells in the blood being transfused, if they recognize the donor, the recipient, as foreign, might launch an attack. Now, in a healthy recipient, the recipient's own white cells would have a counterattack, and all is well. But if histologically or immunologically the donor and the recipient are similar, even a healthy donor could be subject to this transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. And Japan, being a kind of Shimaguni island nation, Japanese people are more similar to each other immunologically than white people in America or people in Spain or people in France. So so we irradiate the blood to keep the white cells from being in the transfused blood from being able to replicate and mount an attack on the patient. In fact, for this reason, my university, Fukushima Medical University, was first in the world to say, in Japan, we're going to do this for all of the blood we transfuse. And now it's a standard in Japan because the risk is so high in Japan. It's like the risk of a one-way match that could cause this lethal disease is about 1 in 8,000 if you get a unit of blood that's not irradiated in Japan. And it's higher if a parent wants to donate for a child because genetically they're even more similar. Among whites like me, the risk starts out lower. It goes up between parents and child. And Spain, so many people crossing cultures, it's even lower yet. But the biggest risk is in Shimaguni, Japan. Yeah. So we can radiate blood at our university. And we were the first center in the world to start doing that to prevent this terrible side effect.
Does that take a long time to do that?
No. If you're using a radioisotope source, it depends on how old your source is. It anywhere can be from 10 to 30 minutes. Yeah. This machine here is an X-ray machine. But X-rays or gamma rays, same effect.
Oh.
Yeah. About 15 gray. If I gave any of you 15 gray, it would kill you. Just like the people who had the Tokai-Mura criticality accident in 1999. Okay, but anyway, speaking of radiation, okay, in addition to FMU, there are 6 hospitals along Fukushima's coast that are supposed to be radiation emergency hospitals, close to the 2 nuclear plants. And
University.
yes, FMU, yeah. So I'm taking for granted. Shame on me for not saying it first. So this is us inland, and then along the coast, hospitals that were trained and prepared to be emergency radiation responders, primary responders. Well, again, with the tsunami, Fukushima Medical University ended up providing primary and secondary radiation emergency response. We already had a brick and mortar radiation emergency room because of that Tokai-Mura criticality accident in 1999 where some uranium processing plant workers violated the standard operating procedure and caused a criticality event. They all got tens of grays of radiation, which killed them. So we had this radiation emergency room, brick and mortar, already in place because the government, central government, said we need to be prepared for the next kind of accident. This brick and mortar room was supplemented by additional portable facilities as the crisis unfolded. Now, one of the ways of decontaminating somebody is using a lot of water, depending on how extensively they've been decontaminated. Most of the time, just taking off your clothes does the job, and maybe washing your exposed, hands too. But we had a water problem, not floods, but the municipal water supply was interrupted. It would take 7 to 8 days to fix. Our on-campus supply is 4 days worth. Each one of those tanks is 150 tons of water. So 4 days of water had to last 7 or 8 days. That meant extreme conservation measures. Modifying laboratory procedures, chemical toilets set up outside for employees and able-bodied volunteers and visitors. And remember, this is March, which
kind of cold.
Can be cold. Yeah. And personal hygiene improvised with alcohol-based sanitizers instead of, scrubbing good and singing happy birthday to get the 30 seconds.
Is that just as good?
Alcohol?
Yeah.
If you're conscientious about it, But if you've got some grit you have to take off your hands, it's a little bit inconvenient not to have running water and so.
Okay.
Now, chairs in our hospital lobby were all replaced with hospital beds. And indeed, some emergency care took place. But the worst case scenario we prepared for never happened. Sadly, this was a disaster of mass fatality rather than mass injury. We stationed people at the main entrance to greet everyone walking through the door and ask, okay, are you here just for radiation exposure check? If that's your only concern, there's a special center set up in Nihonmatsu, 15 kilometers away, for that. Please go there. Are you here for regular appointment, elective surgery? Those have been postponed. We're in an emergency response mode. Are you here for urgent care with or without any concern about radiation? Okay, come in, come with me. And we were wanding people with a Geiger counter for the first week and just not finding anything. So we stopped doing that. But as a precaution up front, yeah. Okay, so ground and air ambulances didn't just bring critical patients in, they took chronic patients out. Think of dialysis, that uses a lot of water. Probably better to take those dialysis patients out of the emergency response area, and especially out of a hospital that doesn't have a lot of water on hand. The nice thing about national health insurance in Japan is we could evacuate patients out of the disaster area to a place somewhat of their choice that might be near other family members. There are no networks that you and I have to deal with in the United States. Okay, so of the 8 hospitals that were in emergency response mode, yeah, Fukushima has 778 beds. We were in the acute phase until April 1, so a total of 22 days. Now, all 8 hospitals in emergency response mode add up to almost 5,000 beds. And you might panic because emergency, do we need to transfuse these patients? Well, actually, the number of patients transfused was lower. If you're a stickler for detail, red cells, fresh frozen plasma, and platelets, but let's just look at the total numbers. And the units transfused were lower. So despite the fact that we couldn't collect or process blood in all 6 prefectures of Tokyo, or all Tohoku, the nationally coordinated Red Cross response brought enough blood into the disaster area to meet this reduced demand. Okay, we're getting close to the communication part of the story. But let's start with face-to-face communication. We had hospital-wide meetings with participants from every department. Now, I want to call your attention to the guy in the lower right, not the one with the big nose, but the one all the way to the right, holding the 2 placards. Might be a little hard to read, but one of the placards is permission to go on the roads. And the other placard is permission to buy gasoline. The roads, gasoline stations were limited inventory, roads were in disrepair. We had to share those placards among staff that had to circulate about. And speaking of sharing, if you look at this box down here, what was available from one day to the next varied, but that day it was a box of rice balls. So the general idea is people would have something to bring back to the other members of the department they were representing. And we were kind of living on rice balls and whatever could be scrounged up for several days. Yeah. And when the rice balls started to be embellished with little slivers of pickled vegetables, that was like food heaven. Okay, so hospital-wide meetings. First, there were 3 a day. 9 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, 9 at night. Then 2 a day, then 1 a day as we got a handle on the situation. This works in Japan. But what about inter-institution communication? Okay. Telephones have come a long way from bell to cell.
Good.
Yes.
To cell.
What we hold in our hands is smaller and lighter. But the infrastructure is still heavy, even if we've cut out a few of the wires. Now, correct me on this. I think of the major wireless vendors in Japan as Docomo, KDDI, SoftBank, and Y-Mobile. Am I leaving anybody out? There's some KDDI, AU, yeah. So 3 of the big vendors have cell towers across the street from our university. In fact, right across the street from my office. And KDDI has their cell tower on the other side of our helipad. Now, equipment varies from one tower to the next. But even if they all had backup power, and even if they were all hardened against electromagnetic pulse, the weak link is still in our hands, isn't it? Because of electromagnetic pulse. Now, to remind you what electromagnetic pulse is, and we're radio people, so it should actually be fairly easy to understand. If North Korea blows up a nuclear device in midair, the gamma rays from that blast will knock electrons out of gas molecules in the atmosphere. Those free electrons in the presence of the Earth's magnetic field will start spinning around. And that generates an electromagnetic field. And the electromagnetic field from an electromagnetic pulse can be in the tens of thousands of volts per meter, enough to fry our portable electronic devices. In fact, fry a lot of solid-state devices. Vacuum tube radios might be a lifesaver in the event of electromagnetic pulse. They're more durable. But hams are catching on to this, and this was in QST quite recently, where hams are figuring out how to fashion what we call a Faraday cage or Faraday shield, completely enclosing equipment in a conductive surface, close to round as possible, and that would ward off the effects of an electromagnetic pulse. Okay, my approach to emergency communications is to have two cell phones through Japan's two biggest carriers on two different hills near my university. The smartphone also contains a terrestrial television receiver. The other phone is not so smart, but like every Lake Wobegon child, is above average. And you know, its battery life is above average too. Smartphone, what do you get? Who gets more than a day out of their smartphone battery? Anybody?
I put in double the size battery.
Okay. Whereas my not so smartphone, I can go a week before needing to recharge.
Yeah, that's a big benefit.
Yeah. And yeah, just like everyone in this room, I'm also a ham operator, and I've had calls in various countries. Because you never know when the phone system is going to misbehave. So, to use a medical textbook as a calibration standard, yes, my uncle's shortwave equipment was all bigger and heavier. But in today's world, you can have smaller and lighter and still talk around the world without cell towers or any other intervening infrastructure. This is one of the points I like to drive home with non-amateur audiences. We all know this, but they don't. And a lot of people don't know how vulnerable cell phones are, or even that they need to have towers nearby. So it has to be explained to people when we're talking about our hobby. Now, when someone with gray hair publishes an article about amateur radio, you might just say it's just some old guy reminiscing about his childhood technological avocation. But when mid-career professionals at the National Library of Medicine and National Institutes of Health publish about amateur radio, yeah, maybe you want to take it a little more seriously, especially when their research has been funded by the United States Navy and Walter Reed Medical Center. Moreover, when a distinguished Yale professor puts his money where his microphone is and endows the Collegiate Amateur Radio Initiative, I think we're onto something. Who's heard of the Collegiate Amateur Radio Initiative? What have you heard about it? Educate us a little bit.
Just that it's trying to reinvigorate what was quite popular 40 years ago, perhaps.
Yes. When you got your operator license 40 or 50 years ago, did your high school or something have a club, or college have a club?
No, it was before that.
Before that even. Yeah. I still see antenna towers on secondary schools and universities, although I also see them sometimes being taken down. But they're trying to reinvigorate what we saw 40 and 50 years ago. And I'm following them on Facebook, and they seem to be having some success. So Yale professor Ed Snyder, in quasi-retirement, gave a bunch of money to the ARRL, College Amateur Radio Initiative. Now, not to be outdone by Yale, I'd like to point out that Harvard just elected a new president.
From MIT.
From MIT, yes. And he has a call sign. How active is he? I don't know the answer to that, but this is good PR for us. And back to Ed Snyder, you know, he's someone who's saying amateur radio needs to have a bigger impact in this age of cell phones and digital communication rather than a lesser impact. Until we explain that to people in different professions, including emergency response in medicine, they're not going to know this. They'll think it's a hobby for people with gray hair, you know, who like to meet in a community center once a month. There's more to it than us. And Tohoku knew this firsthand because our physical communication infrastructure was destroyed along the coast, and the communications infrastructure was overloaded as far away as Tokyo. Does anyone remember trying to use their smartphone on 311 and not being able to get through because everyone else is trying to use it for health and welfare inquiries? Yeah. By the way, so Centers for Disease Control in America normally communicates with public health departments in all 50 states by internet and telephone. But I know from my friends in public health in Minnesota, my home state, they also maintain a backup shortwave link. Okay, and this is a map from the Minnesota Department of Health showing their protocol for communicating by shortwave with the Centers for Disease Control. Okay, remember I mentioned the 38th parallel, and I promised to come back to that. Yeah. The 30th parallel nominally divides North and South Korea. It's kind of hard to get a clear view of what goes on inside the Hermit Kingdom. But we can tell when they explode a nuclear device. We can tell when they launch a missile, yeah? And who remembers August 29th? You'll remember this. At least in Tohoku, our smartphones lit up with the message, missile launch, missile launch. North Korea's launched a missile, please take shelter in a strong building or underground. Did anyone in Tokyo get that?
I think that was Hokkaido, wasn't it?
Hokkaido, yeah. So Hokkaido is, the missile overflew Hokkaido, or close to Hokkaido. So the warning went through Tokyo, through Tohoku, as far south as Fukushima Prefecture. Yeah. And on September 15th, when their other missile launched, I was in Tokyo at the time, in a hotel, you know, just finishing breakfast, and a similar message came out. So maybe you guys got this one on September 15th. Maybe not. Okay. Well, the system that launches these messages, I think they try to be selective and only target the people most likely to be affected. Because otherwise, if we're being bombarded with warnings every day, we'll stop paying attention. But the J Alert system uses smartphones, televisions, community FM, and combines national and regional facilities. J Alert was designed for natural disasters, but it's being adopted and adapted for the threats coming out of North Korea. And you've maybe also seen the loudspeakers in various places in cities and along the coast, and that's part of the J Alert system as well. Okay, what about South Korea? You know, there's all these warm, fuzzy feelings about South and North Korea competing under the common flag in the Olympics. But Seoul is 35 miles from a hostile border, and the two states are still technically at war. So who's ever been to Seoul or any part of Korea? Do you remember seeing emergency supplies in the subway?
My time was way before.
Way before? Seeing emergency supplies? Okay. I'll confess, I don't know when these were put in. I started going to Seoul in 2014, so only starting 4 years ago. But in the subways, you see, okay, vending machines, but also on the right. So chemical, biological, and radiological emergency response supplies, including gas masks and instructions for how to put them on. Not just the subways, but public accommodations like shopping malls also have these emergency supply cabinets in Seoul. And if you keep your eyes out, you can see detection equipment for chemical, biological, and radiological contamination in the air. So they have detectors so that the alerts can be sent out. Now, For a long time, Korea has had something called KIRAMS, the Korea Institute of Radiological and Medical Sciences. I've been there a few times. This is the diorama they have of the emergency, a demonstration of the emergency response they would provide in the case of a radiological emergency. We are learning from our Korean cousins, because they've lived with a threat of attack from North Korea for so long. And yeah. Oh, that's someone's fault. Okay, wasn't sure whose it was. Time to wrap up. So back to the question of hell. In my tradition, maybe Dan's, you know, medieval descriptions of hell seem to foretell the terror of nuclear fission gone out of control. But what about the hell described by C.S. Lewis, British author C.S. Lewis, as a place where people live selfishly? Okay, as I said before, we were out of running water in the city of Fukushima. So people had to queue in line to get water, potable water from water trucks, dispatched to city branch offices. These lines were always peaceful. Anywhere else in the world, you can't even queue for the latest iToy without some skirmish breaking out. There's a home in my neighborhood where 3 generations live under the same roof. The grandparents' restaurant mainly delivers hot meals to the university because there's only so much hospital cafeteria food you can stand. But they also have, you know, but they also have this little lunch counter. After the earthquake, they said, look, no running water, no city gas. The only gasoline we have is what's in our car right now. We're out of business. But you come here every night and sit at our family table. So, to paraphrase an ancient proverb, a little bit shared peacefully is better than a feast in conflict. As close as we may have been to a nuclear hell in Fukushima, it's as far as I've ever been from the selfish hell described by C.S. Lewis. So to summarize, okay, Fukushima reminds us that nuclear accidents did not end in Chernobyl, and any nuclear event may be part of a compound disaster. Ours was an earthquake and tsunami and nuclear crisis. And people who know nuclear power know that this is not going to be the last one. North Korea reminds us that nuclear weapons threats did not end with the Cold War. And let's all remember, especially as amateur radio operators, that we can prepare and everyone has a role. Thank you for your attention.
Very good.
Yes.
The nuclear magnetic pulse.
Yeah.
How does the National Institutes of Health, CDC, expect to maintain a radio link if we're expecting that sort of a situation? Doesn't work.
Yeah, so if the radios are destroyed, yeah, that's right. I have been to a missile silo where some of the antennas are out in the open and some of them are retracted to be deployed after the nuclear exchange takes place. Because you could physically destroy an antenna, you can electrically destroy the equipment with the pulse. But yes, short of having sensitive equipment in a Faraday cage when the blast happens, yeah.
So you mean the atmospheric?
The atmospheric explosion,
would dissipate.
Yeah.
Fairly short.
The electromagnetic pulse would be short-lived. Yes. But if they continue to bombard you with airborne nuclear detonations, that's going to be a problem.
So if it's a big boom, you wait, say, an hour, and then you pop your antennas up.
Yeah.
Hopefully you have power.
Yeah.
Hopefully your equipment works. Hopefully the receiving part is likewise, and then it'll work.
Yeah. Although it's fair to wonder what kind of ionospheric disturbances, if we're going to rely on shortwave, and there are some. I have to read the literature on this because they've done some experiments back when we were still blowing things up in open air with what happens to the ionosphere.
Can I just throw in a footnote?
Please.
You know what is it called in English? I'm not sure. The ministry responsible for amateur radio in Japan. It's known as Somsho in Japan.
Yes.
A good colleague used to be a deputy director there.
Oh, good.
So he mentions to me last year that he says that he was especially concerned about trying to revitalize or make greener the operators, the hand operators in Japan. So, and I've been thinking about it too, what you're saying, especially the Yale man, the Harvard man as well. These things somehow need to get communicated back to the ministry because last 2-3 weeks ago I was at a JARL meeting.
Okay.
And the only things they talk about were contests, how to make short USOs. Like, this is JJ1 ING17. You are 5'9", 73.
Yeah.
And I thought, this makes, in my youth, this was fine. It was fun to talk to the US German guy. But it's no sense now. Pick up the line, you're your own matron. So some of this and what is happening in the US, because what happens in the US gets listened to a lot in Japan, needs to get fed back to them. And this guy has actually asked me out to re-establish links after a year. So as and when he does so, I will mention this. But this needs to get fed back into the system because if Japan can be juvenile, which I doubt, and if the US rejuvenates, and I don't know what's happening in Europe, I don't know, but this is important stuff.
Yeah.
And last but not least, it's not only North Korea which is selfish and many calls it nuclear boom. There's a bigger country on the other side of the Pacific which concerns
Well, a bigger button, yeah.
Yes.
So, I have to agree. I mean, yeah, the current administration is a bit of an embarrassment for someone who speaks English with my particular accent. Yes. Yeah. I think public service communication, which is a broader term that includes emergency communication, EmComm, is a little stronger among North American amateurs than Japanese amateurs. I get the impression, and maybe if you've got connections in Somosho, you can answer. I get the impression that for organizations to have emergency drills and on amateur radio frequencies, there are more hoops to jump through. You can't. Sometimes you have to sort of get the permission of the authorities, or not. Do you have an answer to that?
Wolfgang might be able to fill you in better, but as far as I know, everyone, it's drummed into all the Japanese operators that once you make an emergency communication, you have to submit a written declaration to the ministry saying, I did this, I did that, on this frequency, this way.
Oh, okay.
It's a very onerous obligation. As for the ministry, now, if I can just follow on this, I have two further contacts. One is at the Tokyo office.
Mm-hmm.
One is at the ministry itself, headquarters. Headquarters is really a budget guy, and his complaint is that the Ministry of Finances keeps cutting their salary and
Their budget. Yeah.
And he's having problems maintaining the internet application system. This was his case. I wasn't using it. The Tokyo guy, he was more open, but he's just a following machines. I have to talk to the bigger guy.
Yeah.
Who's really good this time. He served in Brussels once, so he speaks English.
Okay.
And Brussels is what he does. I was thinking, maybe next time I see him, I might be able to imagine he's retired, but he's very busy.
Mhm.
So he's a professor at the university right now. But I might be able to come and give this pep talk, and then you guys. But it's just,
Well,
that's all.
I'd like to learn more from them, and I'd put myself at their disposal too, because, you know, in America, we criticize public servants as a kind of a hobby, but in fact, without Somo Show, where would the country be? So we need them, and we need to support them with more than just tax money. I think we need to support them with our, you know, our best efforts in, for example, EmComm in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when I have the chance, I'll be glad to see what I can push over there and see what I can do.
Oh, great. Oh, that'd be great.
There's been a lot of talk about the next earthquake down toward Kansai area.
Yes.
And of course, they're saying that this is not if only when.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be some movement to provide provisions necessary to handle that. But I'm wondering if that's really enough, or if it's serious enough to get done within a certain period of time, just as a question. Because you hear a lot about it now, news programs and documentaries, but I wonder if anything's really being done to reduce the effect of that kind of mammoth earthquake, shall we say. Do you happen to know anything about it, or do you hear anything about it? Because it would be the equivalent maybe of what happened in this case, I guess.
I've seen simulations on TV of how they think the
Yes.
water would flow. Who's ever been to the Rinkai disaster? I think it's called the Rinkai disaster park. It's right next to Tokyo Bayside. There's a disaster response center.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's also a kind of a museum or about disaster response. Have you seen it?
No, but I've heard of it. A Disneyland like thing.
Kind of Disneyland. Yeah, you can go through a simulated disaster that, and it's on a different presentation, but one of the graphics they have is what's going to happen to the cell phone network and what's going to happen to the landline network in terms of immediate loss and how soon it'll take to bounce back. And I've used that in other presentations to remind people this is why ham radio has to be ready to step in. The wireless network in Tokyo was overloaded on 3/11 because of health and welfare inquiries.
We were not in Japan to that place was Kasan and Dino. I've only just returned some years, but we couldn't come to think of it, we couldn't get through to our son who was living in Tokyo.
Yeah, that's what. Where may I ask where you were for 20 years? Where?
Austria.
Austria. UN?
So
I've been to Vienna a couple times.
agency and so on.
Yeah, okay.
But going back to Dan's point, the really more, as far as I'm concerned, is not Kansai. It's Tokyo. And I happen to be a Red Cross volunteer as well. This last year. And nothing to do after 20 years being away, just try to reintegrate. But they say within 30 years, the possibilities, well, they say 70%, but it's not a possibility in 70% that it will come. Possibility that it will come is within 30 years is 70%, but it will come. Mm-hmm. Now, 5 days later, no one knows. It's different, but it will come. So Dan's question really should be How is it going to affect Tokyo? What can I do?
Yeah, but recently I hear much more about the Kansai area being threat as opposed to Tokyo.
Oh.
That's why I brought that up.
Tokai earthquake is a big scary one. It's right around Mount Fuji.
And you even, like you say, there have been on TV simulations of what that might look like, but you never hear anything about what it might look like in Tokyo if something happened. So that's where I'm coming from on that point. So.
I feel bad for the neighborhoods in Tokyo that I love to walk through the most are the ones that are the most vulnerable. The little houses, the narrow alleys, and yeah. Since you volunteer for the Red Cross, do you still see Yagis on top of Red Cross buildings?
My colleagues and I in the group were thinking of organizing an amateur radio test from the roof.
Okay.
But I haven't been up there yet. They do have several set frequencies, and mainly they should have a big one up there, but mainly it's very small transceivers.
Yeah.
But they have allocated frequencies, but you guys know it's published.
Yeah, what I grew up with is in both America, well, wherever I've worked, so America, Australia, Japan, it's not uncommon to see a Yagi on top of a Red Cross building. It's becoming less common. Or they'll give up on the HF Yagi and at least have some vertical, 2-meter beams or something like that. But in my specialty, transfusion medicine, when transfusion started to get more complicated, even if it stayed under the Red Cross, it became administratively separate and physically separate from the disaster response aspects of Red Cross. So the amateur radio facilities associated with Red Cross are in these buildings over here, and the blood centers are over here. And so a lot of my colleagues in blood, amateur radio is totally foreign to them. And yet, if you're collecting blood in one place, testing it in another, and delivering it to hospitals, that's part of the medical infrastructure that needs emergency communication the most.
Yes.
I'll see what I can find.
Does your hospital or university have an amateur radio club?
We're working on it. We have a few other serious hams, one of whom was a cardiovascular surgeon who only got licensed after 3/11. He said, I get it now. I'm getting my ticket. And he's an avid DXer. He's got a second shack that I can see from my veranda with 2 big towers. And, don't hate me for this, but he rented a hilltop, a 30-year lease for like the equivalent of $3,000. Like,
You can do that?
yeah, because people don't want to sell the land, so they'll lease it to you very, very cheap.
This
Campus itself, we definitely need permission. And one of these other hams, who's actually been a ham for about 30 or 40 years, is working with our administrative people to find a suitable location. We'd like it to be on one of the taller buildings, but also a noise-free building. If you think of all the electrical apparatus that are planted on roofs right now, it can be a challenge to find something that's electrically quiet. NIH has this problem. They have a ham club with an antenna system, but a lot of background noise.
And recently, particularly LEDs,
Yeah.
they create a lot of noise, that I understand. They save power, but they create noise.
Yeah, so that's going to be one of our challenges. But we're moving toward getting permission for a ham club, and the disaster response was part of getting the university president to see the light on this point.
So when do you think it'll happen?
Well, it's been months away for a couple of years now, to tell the truth.
I see.
Yeah. But at least in the States, this Collegiate Amateur Radio Initiative really does seem to be having a positive impact. If you go onto Facebook, Google them. And, I don't post to them very often, but I just follow the activity and it cheers me up because,
gray hair, it's time to hand over the reins to the younger generation.
Either great or none.
Gray hair is better than no hair.
I was resisting saying something. Hey, can I give you one more definition of hell? One more
Yes,
description of hell?
please. Yes, I'm.
Okay, this is anonymous, but I had only read it a week ago. On your last day on earth, the person you became will meet the person you could have become. I shared this with students earlier this week to remind them, whatever it is you want to do, get out there and do it. But you were going to say something. This is how.
No, I just wanted to create collegiate amateur radio network.
Collegiate Amateur Radio Initiative, or CARI. ARRL CARI might be another good tag for getting Google to top it up.
I was wondering, you know, actually this week, this is a little bit off subject, but it's important to get young people involved in our hobby, as you all know. They have the school roundup.
Ah, in North America, right?
North America, yes, this week. And I worked quite a few stations, you know, and really young people, even including middle school. I think one was also grammar school. And it was felt good to be able to work with these really young people, and they're really doing a great job. But I don't think they have anything like that in Japan, do they?
Our local middle school did something with the local club and made an ISS contact.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that too. But this is just mostly HF. They do this this week in February every year. But I don't think they have anything that equivalent in Japan, not that I've heard about. And also, the teachers that are encouraging that in these high schools and middle schools, for example, they also use that as an incentive to get people interested, kids interested. And they usually change operators every half hour, an hour, or something like that.
Everyone gets a chance.
Yeah, everybody gets a chance, and they also have somebody who coaches them, you know, if they don't know what to say or they panic or something. Because most of it's on phone. Because CW is a little more, you have to study a little bit more and so on and so forth, as we all know. So, but it's really generally pretty active. But you also have colleges and universities also participating as well. So in February, it's this particular week. It's
Are you working them from your California station remotely?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And some of them, if it makes sense, you can hear their coach in the background. You know, he's you know, if somebody calls them and they don't know what to say, or they get tongue twisted, or they get a little nervous. You know, he's coaching them. You know, you can hear him sometimes in the background saying, "Okay, you have to say this." And so on. So I said on one of the contacts, it says, "Yeah, I'm remote in Tokyo, so good morning from Tokyo." And so she didn't know what to say, but then he understood it right away. He explained to her what was happening.
So you could hear him.
Yes. It
Oh,
was
very
pretty
good.
funny. He said, "Can that happen?" So if it makes sense to say it, I say it, but I don't say it as a rule. You know?
Yeah.
But I thought it was pretty interesting. If you look on QRZ.com, you see some pretty good websites of some of these stations and who's participating, and you know, see group pictures of all the kids that have got a license and so on. And it's pretty encouraging. There's a lot of people out there doing a lot for the young people to, you know, to get their interest. You'd be surprised.
Yeah. So if we can do that in Japan, great.
Yes, but there's nothing like that in Japan that